I would like to welcome everybody for this evening, for the program. And we are talking today about Passover and about our stories of Exodus. And I'm very excited to have amazing speakers with us and our students that are going to lead us through this program, right? And as you know, or you might not know, this week we are celebrating, the Jewish people are celebrating the holiday of Passover. And the core story, the core element of this holiday is the story of Exodus, the story of Jews leaving Egypt, slavery in Egypt, and coming to the promised land. And our stories and rituals are aim to help us remember and retell the narrative of our collective liberation. And here today, we're going to have the stories of our personal liberation and our collective liberation as humans. And we share this ancient Exodus story year after year so that it resonates through the generations as a story of deliverance from slavery to freedom. Although we have told the story in the beginning of the holiday in Seder, which was last week, we had the ritual Passover meal on Saturday night. Today we'll retell many parts of the story, just to an attempt to continue finding the parallels between our very own experiences and those of the ancient Israelites. We're going to go look at different rituals. We're going to look at different parts of the story, and we're going to hear the stories of some of the people who had their own exoduses throughout their lifetime. And it's really hard to believe when we say, we have this commandment to say every time we celebrate Passover that we were the slaves in Egypt, and as if we ourselves left that and came to this new promised land. It's really hard to relate sometimes. And today I think we're going to share some of the stories where it's going to make it possible for us to relate to that. And I think especially now we're in the second year of pandemic, and this Passover, just like last one, has been very different from all the rest of us that we've had in our lifetime. So to some extent, we also have our very personal experiences of being in this narrow place. And Jews believe that Mitzrayim, Egypt, one of the names for Egypt is Mitzrayim in Hebrew, is the narrow place, that we have been stuck in this very narrow place, and we're ready to go forth, and we're ready to be free. And today we want to grapple with that, and we want to think about it, and we want to experience it firsthand from people who had their own, and think more about our own. Just like I said, Passover is the holiday that has different symbols, and many Jewish holidays, as a matter of fact, have different symbols that help us celebrate and help us think about the holiday. So today we are going to start our exploration with thinking about the main symbols of Passover. And the main symbols of Passover are Pesach, Matzah, and Maror. So I want to invite our student leader and intern, Brian Garcia, to tell us a little bit more about the symbols of Passover.
So one of the many symbols such as these, it is very interesting because they're basically the basis of what is Passover. Matzah, we eat matzah because, that was the only, they had to leave in a hurry. So they weren't able to make bread. They were able to make matzah. And Maror and Pesach, Pesach was because of the sacrifice they had to give, so that when Hashem, God, went through each and every house before, when he was doing the final play, he wanted to make sure that, this is the house of of the Jewish people, and then he would go by and continue on with the plague. And Maror is a symbol of basically the enslavement. So it's very interesting to see that, because you also have to understand that in a way these three symbols are together. They're triangulated in a manner that, if you think about it, one cannot be explained without the other. And what I mean by that is that Pesach is the symbol of sacrifice. What was the one thing that we had to do? We had to sacrifice the lamb. We had to sacrifice what was considered an Egyptian god in front of their very eyes, and show them that this isn't just a god. God, Hashem, is the true God. So that's the symbol of Pesach, the sense of sacrifice, that we have to devote ourselves to God and ensure that this world is made for us to do our best and to sacrifice certain things for us to devote our time to God. So that's Pesach. Maror is the idea of enslavement, the idea that we were beaten down, we were broken both physically and spiritually by the Mitzrayim, by the Egyptians. And so we have to understand that we were once slaves in a foreign land, that we weren't able to perform these sacrifices because we were broken down, we were beaten, and we felt like we were lost. So how is it that, you know, despite the fact that yes, we can still, we want to devote more to God, we want to, you know, sacrifice and show our love and you know, dedication to Hashem, but we're so broken. So how can we do that? And this is where matzah come in, where it's that sense of freedom. It's this sense of like, we were able at that moment in time, God said, no, we have to go now. We have to go now. So it shows that despite the fact it's flat, it symbolizes a sense of freedom, the sense of like, we were able to leave Mitzrayim. We were able to leave in a hurry because of the love and devotion that God showed. And therefore we're going to do the same by reminding our children, each and every generation, these three symbols. So that's the important thing in regards to these symbols, is that they showcase a sense of, you know, a human nature towards God, the things that we feel that we want to perform in front of God, in which we do.
Shalom, everybody. Hope you enjoy this one. It's kind of a rockin' one. If you don't know it, it's just Pharaoh, Pharaoh. Then let my people go. You know? Pharaoh, Pharaoh. Whoa, baby, let my people go. Yeah, 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 yeah. Pharaoh, Pharaoh. Whoa, baby, let my people go. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, the burning bush told me just the other day that I should come over here and say, gotta get my people out of Pharaoh's hand and lead them on over to the promised land. Pharaoh, Pharaoh, whoa, baby, let my people go. Yeah, 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 yeah. Pharaoh, Pharaoh, whoa, baby, let my people go. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, all of God's people came to the Red Sea with Pharaoh's army coming after me. I raised my rod, stuck it in the sand, and all of God's people walked across the land. I said, Pharaoh, Pharaoh, whoa, baby, let my people go. Yeah, 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 yeah. Pharaoh, Pharaoh, whoa, baby, let my people go. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, all of Pharaoh's army was a-coming too. So what do you think that I did do? I raised my rod and cleared my throat, and all of Pharaoh's army did the dead man's float. I said, Pharaoh, Pharaoh, whoa, baby, let my people go. Yeah, 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 yeah. Pharaoh, Pharaoh, whoa, baby, let my people go. Yeah, 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 yeah.
It is my pleasure to introduce the first story of Exodus for tonight. Anita Carl is sharing her story today because of her mother, who made a decision that would save her life and the lives of her three daughters. They escaped from a ghetto in Nazi-occupied Poland and lived as Catholics for the remainder of the war. Carl is one of the youngest survivors of the Holocaust living in Miami. She shares her story whenever she can, and she believes it is important for younger generations to be aware of the atrocities that occurred during World War II. Anita?
Thank you so much. Thank you. My story is a very sad story in many ways. But since we are on the subject of Pesach, God with a strong hand pulled us out from this hell and from the enslavement to the German people, to the Nazis. I was born in Lviv, Poland on May 26, 1938, into a large patriarchal Orthodox and well-to-do family. My father, Samuel, was one of 6 brothers, and my mother, Mali Brandt, was the youngest of 10 siblings. All were married and had several children. Among the millions of Jews brutally murdered, all my aunts, uncles, cousins, and grandparents perished. The only survivor against all odds was my mother and my 2 sisters. What we endured was unimaginable, and just to survive was an accomplishment. But survive with our sanity intact was nothing short of a miracle. When I was 3 years old, the Nazis murdered my father. When I was 3 years old, I was taken to the Lviv ghetto, and the world as I knew it vanished forever. We lived and died in a man-made hell, where it was easier to die than to live. The population of the ghetto reached 150,000 souls. Only 200 survived. I am one of them. When I was 5 years old, thanks to the great courage of my mother, we were able to escape from the ghetto into a strange world where my life as a Catholic girl began. I practiced and learned to love this new religion. When I was 6 years old, the Nazis murdered my father after making him dig his own grave in a forest, and I do not know where he lies, never being able to take a flower to his grave. When I was 14 years old, I comprehended the magnitude, monstrosity, and evil of the crimes committed against us. And how could the world stand by and do nothing? Now, when I look at the sweet faces of my children and grandchildren, I know we not only survived, but we won over the evil that reigned upon us. The lives of my people will continue into infinity. I wish with all my heart that the Holocaust will never be forgotten. We must look into our past so we will have a peaceful future. Today, crimes still linger and live amongst us. I hope that someday we will be free of bigotry, persecutions, and racism, and that the new generations will never allow the horrors of the Holocaust to happen again. I know that if we look into our past, we will not forget the Holocaust and the barbaric things that not too long ago, only 70 some years ago, happened to us. How we were caught in the middle of a war, a terrible, terrible war, and how methodically they executed all our brothers and our sisters. From the 6 million people that perished during the Holocaust, 1.5 million were innocent children that will never be able to have a future, to discover a medicine to save lives. So that's why I tell you all to always do something when you see evil. Never be a bystander. Remember that you have the power and the strength to do that, like my mother did for the 3 little girls that we were. And from the hell of the Holocaust, she brought us into the freedom of the world that we live in today.
On Passover, there are 4 questions. We usually asked by the youngest child. There were 4 questions for tonight. We eat matzah to remember that the Jews had no time to bake their bread before rushing to leave Egypt. What do you carry with you? What are you too rushed to do? We eat bitter herbs to remind us of the bitter life that the Jewish people experienced as slaves in Egypt. What's a challenge you faced this year? What's the greatest thing you learned from it? We did the parsley into salt water. The vegetables remind us of spring and new life. The salt water reminds us of the tears of the Jewish slaves. When we dip, we remember the pain of the past and hope of a new future simultaneously. How do you remember the past? How are you going to change the future? On all other nights, we sit eating upright or reclining, and it's on this night that we all recline. What makes you feel comfortable? When are you free to relax and recline?
Matzah is also known as ha-lachem anya, the bread of affliction in Aramaic. It's in the first passage from the Maggid section of the Passover Haggadah. It is at the heart of the Seder, the ritual Passover meal, where participants tell the story and read interpretations of the Exodus from Egypt. It is fitting that we too look at this text. This is the bread of affliction, which our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. Let all who are hungry come and eat. Let all who are needy come and celebrate Passover. Now we are here. Next year may we be in the land of Israel. Now we are slaves. Next year may we be free. And that's from the Passover Haggadah.
So speaking about the 4 children, I'm gonna first read the first part in Hebrew. Baruch HaMakom, Baruch Hu, Baruch Shanatan, Torah, Lamo, Israel, Baruch Hu. Keneged, Arbe, Benaim, Debra, Torah, Echad, Chacham, Be'echad, Rasha, Be'echad Tam, Be'echad, Sheino, Yodea, Lishol. So the Torah speaks of 4 types of children. One is wise, one is wicked, one is simple, and one does not know how to ask. So the wise child asks details about the specific meaning of the laws of Pesach. So what are the testimonies? What are the statutes? What are the laws of Adonai or God has commanded you? To which we respond with one of the very specific laws of the Pesach Seder. Rasha ma uomer, ma avodah, Atot lachem belo lo ulifnei no ulefi shetzid et tzimomin chachal kafar be'iker be'afata aka et shanaiv be'emor lo be'abur se asa Adonai li betzeti Mimsraim li velo elu aye sham lo aya negal. So the wicked child asks, whatever does this mean to you? The author admonished this child as one who is not concerned about the laws personally, but only for others. This exchange reminds us of the importance of not separating ourselves from our community or from traditions that might seem uncomfortable or foreign to us. but rather to engage with them in ways that enable us to connect with our community. The simple child asks, "What does this mean?" To which a straightforward summary of the story is given, directly from the Torah. "It was what a mighty hand that God brought us out of Egypt, the house of bondage." Exodus 13:14. In response to the child who does not know how to ask, we are instructed to open it up and explain, "It is because of what God did for me when I went free from Egypt."
So I always say that I am Jewish because I am Cuban. So how does that happen? Well, because I'm very aware that I am a child of a double exodus. My grandparents left Europe in the 20s to go to Cuba. And then my parents and grandparents and other family left Cuba to come to the United States. So I'm really a product of these two exoduses or these two diasporas. And because my grandparents, my four grandparents, found refuge in Cuba on the eve of the war, on the eve of the Holocaust, they survived. And thanks to them surviving, I was able to be born 2 generations later. Now, a lot of people don't realize that Cuba was this important refuge for Jewish people because we're all familiar with the case of the St. Louis boat. This was a boat with 934 German Jewish refugees trying to get to Cuba. And they got to the dock, and people were not allowed to get off the boat, and they were sent back to Europe. That same ship, the St. Louis, also went to the United States and to Canada, and they were also refused entrance into those countries. But Cuba is often blamed for that, when in fact, Cuba was a refuge for many, many Jews. Relative to their size, they took in a lot of Jewish refugees, particularly in the 20s and 30s. So something to know about the Jews of Cuba was that the community was very diverse. The first group of Jews to settle in Cuba as Jews, as openly practicing Jewish people, were actually American Jews. This was after the Spanish-American War. So in the early 1900s, American Jews settled in Cuba and opened restaurants and businesses. And in fact, they built the first Jewish cemetery as well in Cuba, which is on the outskirts of Havana in a town called Guanabacoa. And then subsequently, the next group to come were Sephardic Jews, mostly from Turkey, though some were from Syria as well. And then the next group to come were Jews from Eastern Europe, and so many of them were from Poland that to this day, the term for a Jewish person in Cuba is Polaco. They will call anybody who they think is Jewish a Polaco, even if their family is Sephardic from Turkey. They're all Polacos because there were so many immigrants that came from Poland. Now, in my own family, I'm lucky to have the combination of being Ashkenazi on my mother's side and Sephardic on my father's side. So my maternal grandparents were from Eastern Europe, from Poland and Russia. And then my father's parents were from Turkey. And almost all those immigrants from Turkey came from a small town called Silivri, very, very close to Istanbul. And so all these different Jewish people settled in Cuba, not just in Havana, they spread out all over the island. And they were very separate from each other. The Jews that were Ashkenazi kind of kept to themselves, and the Jews that were Sephardic kept to themselves because they had different languages, different cultures, different cuisines. And so that was very interesting. And they all built synagogues and schools, restaurants. They had stores. Some of the men were peddlers, as my paternal grandfather was. And they built a very vibrant Jewish community. There were always people that were using Cuba as a way to get to the United States. But the people who stayed, the people like my family and so many people that I know in the community, that came to be the size of about 15,000 people, those are the people that really loved Cuba and wanted to stay in Cuba forever. And one of the most poignant things for me about my community is that in the 50s, right on the eve of the Cuban Revolution, which started in 1959, right on the eve of the revolution, this community of 15,000, they were building so many Jewish institutions because they thought they were staying forever. They even expanded the cemetery. They built a Jewish community center right in La Habana, right near Calle Linea, like a very, very impressive center because they thought they were staying. And then the revolution came in 59. They initially supported it. And then soon after, they became disillusioned as the revolution moved towards socialism, and as it became clear that the Jewish schools were going to be closed down and that pretty soon religion was not going to be something that could easily be practiced in Cuba. It was going to be suppressed. And so this Jewish community in the early 60s, a large part of the community, 90% of the people, decide to leave. And that's when my family decides to leave. I was 4.5 when we left Cuba. My parents made the decision to leave very quickly, as did many Jews in Cuba. My father was actually held at gunpoint because he was taking care of a store that belonged to my mother's uncle, and these milicianos wanted him to turn in the keys. And he didn't want to, and they held him up at gunpoint. He got really scared and rushed home and said, we have to leave Cuba. And so we left in a rush. It was, very similar to the Passover story, of leaving in a rush and just taking a suitcase. You couldn't take very much with you when you left Cuba in this era. And in our case, most people went directly up to Miami and New York, but we couldn't go to the United States because my parents had never traveled outside of Cuba. They were very young parents in their early 20s with me and my brother, 2 small children. And so they couldn't come to the United States, but they were able to go to Israel. And we actually went to Israel for a year. And interestingly enough, we lived in a kibbutz, which I always thought was kind of funny because we were escaping one form of socialism and going into an Israeli form of socialism. And we went and lived on a kibbutz for a year, and then we came to the United States. And I grew up in New York, but with a lot of family in Miami, so we were always going back and forth between Miami and New York. And this community that left Cuba was so sad about having to leave a place that they really came to love. I always thought about this. My maternal grandmother from Poland would always say, oh, I don't have any desire to go back to Poland, but Cuba I would go back to. Cuba they loved. This Jewish community really fell in love with Cuba, and it was great sadness that they left Cuba and restarted their lives in the United States, which they did by creating synagogues. In Miami, you probably know that there's a Ashkenazi Cuban synagogue called the Cuban Hebrew Congregation. There's Temple Moses, which is a Sephardic Cuban synagogue. There's another synagogue, Temple Menorah, that many, many Cuban Jews go to. And they recreated their lives in the US, but always with a very clear sense that they were from Cuba, they spoke Spanish, cooked Cuban food, just as this was the case with my family. And for me, I'm a cultural anthropologist as well as a writer. I always heard the stories about Cuba, and it made me so curious to want to go to Cuba and see it with my own eyes and see what was left of this Jewish heritage on the island. And so I started going back about 30 years ago, traveling there, doing research, writing a book about the Jews of Cuba. And one of the very interesting things I learned is that the story of Passover was very important to the small Jewish community that was left in Cuba. And during the 60s and 70s and 80s, which were the really tough, hardline years of the revolution with a lot of suppression of freedom and particularly of religious freedom, the holiday that meant so much to people was Passover. And they would get a Passover package from the Canadian Jewish Congress, because at the time there was no connection with the United States at all, no relationship. And they would get this matzah package each year for the Jewish community, but the package would often arrive late. So instead of arriving like March, April, it would arrive in September. So they would get the Passover package, way after the holiday had passed, but it was still so meaningful to them. And then later on, after the 90s, when Cuba opened up to religion and many American Jews started traveling to Cuba, suddenly they were receiving lots of matzah, so much matzah that they had matzah to eat all year. And so then people would say that they were eating the bread of affliction all year in Cuba. So there's a very small community left there of about maybe 900 people at this point. And right now, just like we're doing here, they're unable to meet in the synagogue, which they would normally be having a really large Passover party where the whole community gets together and celebrates together, does the whole Seder together. They can't do that at the moment. They're also socially isolating as we are, but they're hoping in the coming year to be able to celebrate Passover. So for me, I've always had this great consciousness of having these two cultures, the Cuban and the Jewish, and always trying to weave them together in Spanish and English as well. And I don't know if there's time, but I would love to end with a poem, if I may, Olga.
Of
Okay,
course,
so
go ahead.
I'm going to end with a poem. This is from a book of poems, Everything I Kept, that I wrote in English and Spanish. I'm just going to read the English version. It's kind of an Exodus poem, and it's called Prayer. Too often I am on my way home, driving down familiar streets, only a few blocks to go, and out of nowhere a merciless hand comes and wrings my heart dry. I tremble. Fog clouds my eyes. I am no longer sure if I am awake or dreaming. If I die, who will find me? All I can do is pray. Don't take me yet. Let me return home. I am almost there. Please? I don't know why this happens. What I know is that so far my prayers have been answered. Hardly breathing, I reach my house, and when I open the door, I hear many keys clanging. The keys my ancestors stubbornly took with them to their exile.
On Passover, we remember the 10 plagues that were inflicted on the Egyptian people. Thousands of years later, modern-day plagues of inequality should ignite contemporary responses to combat these injustices. Many of the most vulnerable members of our society are disproportionately affected. They cannot be passed over or ignored, especially during this important holiday. This moral impetus has become even clearer as our society and the world has grappled with the twin modern-day plagues of the COVID-19 pandemic and renewed widespread awareness and reckoning of racial injustice. As we think about the ancient plagues, let us also keep in mind those who still live under the weight of modern plagues. And now, just as Olga said, I'll be dipping my pinky in the wine for each one. So, a justice system that instills fear and divides communities does no justice at all. It must be independent and fair to foster an equal and racially equitable society. Just as the first plague of blood recalls violence and turmoil, we must take action to reform our criminal justice system so that it meets the highest ideals of society and overcomes the brokenness, the spilled blood that began this cycle, a cycle steeped in systemic racism. Today, essential pathways to opportunity are blocked by a lack of basic shelter and affordable housing. Just as the plague of frogs transformed the Egyptians' homes into unlivable conditions, the lack of affordable housing can make even the most basic aspects of daily life burdensome. Until more affordable housing units are created, too many people in need will experience homelessness. Today's healthcare system remains out of reach to so many. Millions of Americans still do not have insurance. The plague of lice reminds us that affordable, quality healthcare is important to have even when we are healthy, and especially when unforeseen circumstances arise. We must work to advocate for those who do not have access to healthcare to ensure that all Americans can receive the treatments that they need. Sadly, the plague of gun violence in America is all too familiar. Guns kill nearly 40,000 Americans each year. Gun violence runs rampant in our communities, as did the wild animals in the fourth plague, but we have the power to end this scourge ourselves. We are commanded to take necessary measures to ensure the sanctity of human life and safety of our communities. Hunger is not a distant tragedy. It is present in every community. Our tradition is explicit in commanding that we feed the hungry, and we must work to make that a reality. The plague of cattle disease reminds us how important it is to ensure that all people have the resources and support needed to live free from hunger. The disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on communities of color is just one symptom of a deeper problem. Due to centuries of systemic racism, people of color are more likely to face a range of negative health outcomes and shorter life expectancies, but are less likely to have health insurance and often face discrimination in the healthcare system. Just as racial inequity in public health plagues us today, so did boils plague the Egyptians when this health crisis impaired their lives and livelihood. We must all take action to mitigate and adapt to the effects of climate change, but we cannot lose sight of the fact that climate change most significantly affects low-income communities and people of color. The climate
The climate disruption of the plague of hail is a reminder that it is our responsibility to take action to prevent climate disruption in communities where such events have an especially devastating impact. Our tradition speaks strongly to valuing workers' essential dignity as well as maintaining healthy families. Just as the locust disrupted work and resources for the Egyptians, so does the lack of paid sick days and family leave harm families and workplaces across the United States. Without a national guarantee of paid leave, workers face agonizing choices between their health and their livelihoods. Education is the key to opportunity and prosperity, and the fewer the educational resources, the more challenging it is for students to advance in society. The plague of darkness reminds us to pursue a bright future for all our children through robust public education. We cannot keep some members of our community on the margins by denying them educational opportunities. There are many structural policy changes that we can make to ameliorate economic inequality. The pain and suffering of the plague of the death of the firstborn does not remind us of any one social justice issue, but it does remind us of the importance of taking action before crises become truly dire. Increasing the minimum wage to a living wage addresses the previous 9 plagues by lifting millions of people, including millions of children, out of poverty and preventing them from suffering these plagues in the first place.
Hi, my name is Vicki Glicken. I'm the senior cantor at Temple Emmanuel in Dallas, Texas, and I'm so thrilled and honored to be able to share with you the story of my family's exodus. I was born in 1979 in Ukraine, and one of my most distinct memories of growing up and realizing that I'm Jewish is from first grade. I was about 7 years old, and it was the second day of school, and my classmates and I were going to pick up library books, and I remember holding a library card in my hand, and on the library card were my last name, my first name, my grade, and then my nationality. And I remember looking around at everybody else's cards and seeing that everybody else's nationality was Russian or Ukrainian. Even though my family had lived in Ukraine for generations, my nationality was Jewish. I don't remember that anyone necessarily told me that it was bad, but it was different. And so I remember being embarrassed by that. And I remember holding a library card strategically so as to cover up the nationality line so that no one would see that mine said Jewish. In truth, growing up, there were a lot of stories of anti-Semitism that were all around me. There was a story of my grandfather who, a very gifted engineer, eventually he became the CEO of a clothing factory. Of course, it was communism, so it was the factory was still owned by the government, but he became the CEO of this clothing coat making factory. But this was earlier in his career, and he was nominated to represent Russia in the United Nations. And so he came in for his interview, and there were 2 gentlemen who were sitting at the desk for his interview. And the first started asking him different questions, and the second one said, no, he doesn't qualify. And the first one said, well, what do you mean? Of course he qualifies. And he started listing all of his attributes that signified that he did qualify. And the second gentleman said, no, he doesn't qualify. And the first guy was still kind of clueless, not getting it. And eventually the second guy said to him, look at his 5th graph. And so the 5th graph was the nationality line. And so the first guy looked at the 5th graph, the nationality, realized that my grandfather was Jewish and said, oh, yes, you're right, he doesn't qualify. So there was this story. There was the story of a professor who in his own home, in the privacy of his own home, was teaching his children Hebrew. And the story then continued that eventually he was arrested and sent to the Gulag for teaching his children Hebrew. There was also the story of my family where one day my great-grandparents lived on a 5th floor walk up. Imagine that, going up to the 5th floor, no elevator, of course. And they came down the stairs as they were leaving the house just on a regular day. And across the lobby of their building, there was a banner that said, "Kill the Jews, save Mother Russia." So lots and lots of stories of anti-Semitism that I heard growing up, that I experienced myself. And it was a very stark reality, knowing that even though you speak the same language, you look like everyone else, that somehow you are different, and most importantly, you are not wanted. And so this feeling of not being wanted is something that really stuck with me, and something that I remember experiencing as a child. And I had a very happy childhood. I had lots of friends. I did well in school. My teachers really liked me. And even as I had lots of friends, I remember this boy who liked me, and I think we were in 4th grade at the time, and I was taking piano lessons at school, and so I was playing the piano, and he ran through the halls screaming well, I don't, screaming slurs and slander, basically, using bad words to talk about Jews. So, these memories are kind of part of my story, and of who I am, and that sense of, like I said, of being unwanted somehow. And so in 1992, when I was 13 years old, my family finally received permission to immigrate to the United States. Now, something that you should know is that in order to qualify to come to the United States, our application process began 3 years earlier. We had to travel to the capital at the time, Moscow, and we had to undergo interviews and prove that, in fact, we were experiencing anti-Semitism, prove that we could be productive citizens should we be granted the permission to immigrate to the United States. And for all of our family members, our entire family, all of us went through background checks and basically ensuring that we would be productive citizens should we be accepted to the United States. Now, that process, as I told you, took about 3 years, and eventually we received what's called refugee status. This is a status that basically signifies to the American authorities and to the world that we are in need of refuge. And so we then were able to come to the United States. Now, we came to the United States on the 4th of July, 1992. And one of the incredible things about coming to the United States was that we landed and it was after dark. And as we were traveling from the airport to our new home, there were fireworks in every direction. Everywhere we looked, there were fireworks for the 4th of July. And I remember turning to my uncle and saying, "Oh my gosh, look at these amazing fireworks. Why are there fireworks everywhere?" And he said, "Well, Vicky, everyone is so excited that you are finally here." And so to move from that feeling of being unwanted in the place where you were born and in the place where your ancestors had lived, to being welcomed with open arms was such an incredible, incredible feeling. It's a feeling that I treasure to this day, and it's a feeling that has truly given me the opportunity to continue to want to reach my potential and to continue to want to make sure that our country is welcoming to all those who are in need of refuge even today. And so perhaps that is as much of my story of the Exodus as is the story of my family. The sense that in Passover, we're told, Bechol dor vador, in every generation, we are taught to imagine as if we ourselves had escaped from Egypt, as if we ourselves had been immigrants. Now, for me, my story of being an immigrant and my story of being a refugee is actually a personal story. But the truth of the matter is that in Judaism, we are taught and we're called to take in that empathy and to take in that memory and history and to make it our own. And we do so recognizing that were it not for an accident of birth, any one of us could have been born in a place where we couldn't live. Any one of us could have been in a place that required us to leave everything we know and love behind and to come to a new land. Any one of us could have been the one to experience the story of the Exodus in modern day. And so my blessing and my wish to each of us this Passover is that as we go through the holiday, we imagine ourselves as if we were just like our ancestors, imagined and real, who escaped from dangers and from adversity, who found their home in this country, and who continue to advocate for liberty and equality and justice and fairness for all of our citizens, regardless of faith, creed, religion, gender, sexual preference, sexual orientation, I should say, or any other qualifier. So my hope and my prayer is that we continue to create a society that's more just, a society that is respects the equality and the humanity of each of our citizens. And Chag Sameach, happy Passover to you and to yours.
All right. All right, Ilu Hotzi, everybody. That's the first line. Ilu Hotzi, Hotzi, Anu, Hotzi, Anu, Mi Mitzrayim, Hotzi, Anu, Mi Mitzrayim, Dainu, Dai, Dainu, Dai, Dainu, Dai, Dainu, 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 Dai, Dainu, Dai, Dainu, Dai, Dainu, 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 Torah, Ilu Natan, Natan Lanu, Natan Lanu, Eta Torah, Natan Lanu, Eta Torah, Dainu, Dai, Dainu, Dai, Dainu, Dai, Dainu, 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 Dai, Dainu, Dai, Dainu, Dai, Dainu, 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 Shabbat, Ilu Natan, Natan Lanu, Natan Lanu, Et HaShabbat, Natan Lanu, Et HaShabbat, Dainu, Dai,